1 week ago from today, there was the Super Bowl. And it's the only day of the year that I actually get to watch a game for free from start to end. But I've noticed over the years that their commercials are unique, and sometimes they intentionally target men to turn their eyes. So probably 5 to 10 years ago, I started to turn off the commercials, or at least change the screen. So last week, as I'm watching some of the game, the commercials would come. I would switch programs on my computer. I could still hear it in the background, and I would wait to see or hear when the announcer for the game would come back. Then I'd know that the commercials were over. Well, I was busy doing something else, but on one rare occasion, I actually heard what they were saying. I guess you could say it was in my conscience, maybe not just in my subconscious. And it was the strangest, evil statement. It said, "We should all be happy. We all have freedoms." He went on to say, wouldn't it be nice if we had, like in our car, we have an owner's manual for our car to tell us how to use it. Wouldn't it be nice to have an owner's manual for life? And I'm thinking, we do. And his next statement was, since we don't, then we need to do whatever we want to do. To be happy. And then the commercial, believe it or not, was not 30 seconds long. It wasn't 60 seconds long. It was a full 2 minutes, where many people's favorite actor, Harrison Ford, is speaking in the commercial. And he goes throughout to say, we have freedoms, we can honor those who have served our country, and they're doing their best to stir your hearts. But in the conclusion, he said, since we don't have an owner's manual, and our purpose in life is to be happy, then do whatever it takes to be happy. And the time is ending in the commercial, and he says, I spend my time with family. I spend my time with friends. And at that point, he gets inside of his vehicle, puts his arm on the door, and he says, and something else makes me happy. A Jeep. So what's the point of the commercial? If you want to be happy in life, then buy a Jeep Wrangler, and you will be happy. And if you'll listen attentively to all the commercials out there, you'll find something common about the vast majority. They have to shred any biblical truth, and this is their word-for-word statement as well. Sometimes they have to degrade the listeners so much and destroy their self-image so much that they have to buy our product to feel better about themselves. So if we have to blaspheme God, if we have to destroy truth, if we have to degrade their morality, who cares? Just give me your money. I want to take that point to springboard into our message today. We do have an owner's manual. It's called the Bible. And in the Bible, we have God's principles for life. But sadly, most people read their Bible about as often as they read the owner's manual to their car. Do you have an owner's manual? Oh yeah, it's in the glove compartment of my car. I think it's really important. I think it's great. It can make the car last a lot longer. Do you know what it says? No, but I have it in a safe place. And for many people, they know their Bible is on the coffee table or on a shelf. I have a Bible, therefore I'm going to heaven. But what does it say? They usually don't know. Our message today is the importance of the Bible, and I'd like for you to look at one particular passage This is Leviticus chapter 26. It's often when I have a sermon series that will take several weeks. Well, this one was only 3 weeks. It lasted or started just 2 weeks ago, and the first one was to experience all of life. First, we need to admit how wretched our hearts are, that we are sinners. And then last week's message, taken out of Leviticus, was that God has provided a way. He has given us a way to be atoned for our sins. But we didn't end it with just those two, because there's more to the Bible than that. It's more than just praying a prayer and becoming a Christian and then going to do whatever I want to do to be happy. There's a third part, and that is acknowledging that we have an owner's manual and we need to obey it. We need to know what it says and actually do it. So today's message is actually part 3 in a 3-part series. The first was admit your sinfulness and wretchedness and your total dependence on God. The second part was how we can reconnect with God, have our life to be renewed with Him. And then today, once we've recommitted, we need to start obeying what He has said. So look now at Leviticus chapter 26. And I want us to look at the first main point, which is the commands, which are not suggestions. Now, these are not all the commands in the Bible. This is kind of like a generic overview. But look first at verse 1 to see what we are not to do. He says, "You shall not make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar, nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it." We've mentioned this many times that in America today, we don't necessarily think of an idol as an object made of wood or stone or jewels, or maybe gold pressed into shape of a calf. But we have idols today like Jeep Wranglers. We have things in our life that we think give us real joy and happiness. Maybe it's the things we watch on our cell phones. Maybe it's the things we watch on the internet. Maybe it's grandkids or kids. There are a bunch of things we can put before the Lord. So idols, we know, are not necessarily tangible objects. They could be intangible, almost invisible. We can make anything be an idol. So we see here what not to do. Now let's look at verse 2 to see what we are to do. And he mentions just this little reference, which is, "You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary." Well, he could have mentioned many things, but he mentions these two. And I think we need to take the same perspective for this as Jesus took for "thou shalt not kill." Remember when Jesus said, in the Old Testament it says, "Thou shalt not kill," but I say unto you, we should show respect for every human being. There's one specific statement in the Old Testament, but it's expanded in the New Testament to be a bigger picture. In this one, it's the legalistic command to keep the Sabbath and reverence the sanctuary. But the big picture is we need to find God to be holy, and we need to worship Him. The emphasis is not the building. The emphasis is not going to church. The emphasis is to enjoy the Lord, to make Him our priority. Had someone recently to ask me, "How come you don't want to be the head coach of a high school sport like wrestling?" And I said, well, there are a few reasons, but one is, I'm not going to miss church on Sunday to do something like wrestling. My heart is with the Lord, not with other things like that. God tells us what not to do, And then in verse 2, he tells us in a simplistic way what we are to do, and that is to have a heart for God. But now I want to move to what the bigger picture for chapter 26 is about. And beginning with verse 3, we have a conditional sentence. You could say it's so lengthy, it's a conditional paragraph. If you do this, then here will be the results. And we're going to look at just the first portion, which is, if you obey me, here will be the blessings. And for time's sake and for many other reasons, we're not looking at the last portion, which says, if you do not obey me, here will be all the consequences. And if you want to read this after today, the second major portion, you'll be amazed. When God says, here are the consequences, you'll go, wow, that's going on in the United States right now. Yeah, that's going on in the United States. Yeah, and the next, and the next. But we're not going to focus on the negatives. Let's look at the positives, which come from verse 3. This is the condition to receive God's blessings. He says, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out. I asked someone recently about a relationship with the Lord. One particular one was in a restaurant. And I asked a waitress, I gave her the quick plan of salvation, and then she immediately followed and she said, well, I love Jesus. And my grandfather was a pastor. And I go to church when I can. I said, what? But she's completely missing the main point. And when the passage says, walk in my statute, that does not mean have a Bible on a coffee table. It doesn't mean to memorize John 3:16. It doesn't mean to go to church. It literally, truthfully means, if I can twist the picture a bit, how would you feel if I said to be a Christian, you have to read the owner's manual for your car and actually live it? Change the oil every 3,000, 5,000 miles. Make sure the air pressure in your tire is 32 pounds per square inch if you have that size car. Or change the radiator fluid so many hundreds of thousands of miles. For many people it would be, you mean I really have to read it and do it? I have a close relative, he didn't know you change the oil, so he drove his car over 50,000 miles without changing it. And since the car was still running, he still has great positive statements to say about that company. That's not how we live our life. We really, really, truly are to read the Bible, and when it says something, we do it. Thus, the phrase at the end of my outline, the condition to receive God's blessings is to live it out. It's more than just have the right answers. Oh yeah, we learned that in Sunday school when I was a kid. Oh, I learned it in Vacation Bible School. But instead it's, oh, there's God's ideal. I am not that ideal. I need to change. Whether it's praising the Lord, whether it's changing a lifestyle that's evil and getting rid of it. So when we obey God, whatever it says, to add something, to remove something, to change something, we obey Him. Let me give you a good illustration of someone who's obeying the Bible. Over a week ago, one of the many pastors at First Baptist Church, Orlando, went back to his house at the end of the day and found his wife bludgeoned almost to death. Turns out that some guy broke into the place to steal some stuff, saw her, beat her mercilessly until she went unconscious. After he left, she didn't know what to do, so she couldn't call on the cell phone because he took her cell phone. She went to the car and tried to press the horn, hoping someone in the neighborhood would hear her. No one came. She went back to the house, waited for her husband to return several hours later. Immediately took her to the hospital. She did not survive. For some reason, I need to read the story over again to see, but they took pictures of her as they found her. Had to verify, was this truly your wife? You know all the way they do that. What are you going to do with these pictures? He said, I want a picture of this. Why? He wants to take it to the guy who murdered his wife and say, I forgive you for what you've done. He's not saying that he's pardoning the other man. He doesn't have that power. He still needs to be punished. But he's obeying the Bible, which says forgive others, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done. But an immature Christian says, no, I can't do that. I don't want to. You don't know what people have done to me. And God says, no, you don't know who I, God, am. I say, forgive. And he chooses to do that. That's just one episode of obeying God when he says, do this. Well, let's move to the last part of the message, or the bulky part, which is the blessings. He said, if you will just obey me, look at what happens. So verse 4, he says, I shall give you the rains in their season. Do not believe the lies that our world propagates. The reason our ice is melting, the reason we have rain and snow is because of that other political party who promotes things that causes global warming and climate change. Do you know what those people are saying? They're actually bowing down to that other political party and saying, oh, those great gods of the universe, they control the rain. No, they don't. God controls the rains. When we have a drought, all we have to do is pray to God, and if the circumstances meet His will, He will provide the rain. In their season, look what's next, so that the land will yield its produce and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. Another way of saying this is, God will never allow a person who obeys Him to go hungry. Now realize there are exceptions to God's principles sometimes. Sometimes you're a prisoner of war. Sometimes you were captured because you were a Christian and they intentionally starve you to death. That would be an exception. But when people say, I just can't make a living, it's that bad old political party, whichever one, it's all their fault that my cost of living has gone up. Wait a minute. We go back to God's promises, which say, if we will obey Him, He will meet our needs, including the ability to eat. I will say I have a little difficulty with verse 5. I can't complain at God. What He ever says is true. But let's look at verse 5. Indeed, your threshing will last for you until grape gathering, and grape gathering will last until sowing time. You will thus eat your food to the full and live securely in your land. The part that that personally bothers me is you can eat to the full. I know what it was like a couple of times in my life to be hungry. And I still have a hard time sometimes eating a full meal thinking there's so many other people who are hungry. But God is so wonderful to us. He wants us to enjoy a full meal. Now, He's not saying overdo it. But He does want us to eat comfortably, completely, because He loves us. And He wants us to be satisfied in our eating. But you notice in there, He said the threshing, then the sowing. What He's talking about is different fruit and different plants will produce at different times of the year, so that you will always have something to eat at different times during the year. What a gracious God. He's the one who orchestrated that. It wasn't evolution. Let's move on to verse 6. I shall also grant peace in the land, so that you may lie down with no one making you tremble. Think of places like Ukraine, where so many people, they don't know if the next bomb that's being sent overhead from Russia is going to land in their location. I mean, I heard recently that Russia sent like 75 or a few hundred missiles all at the same time to bomb the place. But God says in this passage, and I should have mentioned this a little bit more detail earlier, this is a promise between God and Israel, but the principles in some respects still apply today for us. I want to go back to a previous point in there when we talked about a commitment between God and us. There are two different types of commitments. One is contractual, one is covenantal. Contractual says, if you do this, I will do that. You do this, I do that. The covenant says, I will meet your needs no matter what. Now, God had a contractual relationship with the children of Abraham by blood. He has a covenantal relationship with the children of Israel by faith. He will never separate from the believers, what we would call Christians, the people who follow him totally. Those are the children of Abraham by faith. But in a contractual basis, he says, if you do this, you will get the consequences. If you do the right things, you'll get all of the blessings. This passage can apply to places like government structures and even nations. And that's why God has blessed America so much, because the nation as a whole used to worship God in a greater way. Let's move on to verse 7. He says, but you will chase your enemies, and they will fall before you by the sword. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000. And your enemies will fall before you by the sword. So what's the greatest way to build up the defense of our country? The answer is obey God. It's not sending billions and billions of dollars to build bigger bombs to blow up other people. The greatest minister of defense statement would be, obey God, and God will protect your land. He just said 5 of your people can chase after 100 and run them out of town. God can do anything. Look at verse 9. So I will turn toward you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will confirm my covenant with you. You will eat the old supply and clear out the old because of the new. Moreover, I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul will not reject you. I will also walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. These are the blessings that God promises. When his people, primarily in the national context, if they will just obey God, they get all these blessings. I think one of the saddest days, if I could say that, would be 1 second after we get to heaven. Because we'll look back at earth and go, and I know there will not be any sadness in heaven, but let me continue. We'll look back on our life here on earth and say, why didn't I obey the Lord? Look at all these blessings I could have had. But I was so busy chasing after fun and staying busy and doing things my way. For us to obey God completely, it just so happens the emphasis we'll have in the next 3 months will highlight this and go deeper into this. How can we obey the Lord to experience life's greatest treasures? Well, I want us to conclude the message with this very last section, which is interesting. The reasons why God should be obeyed. I've been asked this by many people over the years. Who does God think He is that He should make us obey Him? Who does He think He is that He thinks He's greater than every other God? We all have our certain route that we want to go through to get to the end result. That's what I hear fairly often from people. So I want us to address this question, reasons why God should be obeyed. He's not a controlling tyrant. He's not a monster who demands you obey Him. Let's look at the first point. In verses 1 and 2 and 13, we see we should worship God because of who He is. When you go to verse 1, He makes these commands and says, "For I am the Lord." Verse 2, here are the things you should not do, because I am the Lord. And then verse 13, He begins, I am the Lord. I am Jehovah. I am the only one. The statement that there are other gods is such a joke. The God of the universe is so big, the Bible says the entire universe fits within the span of His hand. Only God knows everything. He has orchestrated everything. There's no other God out there who comes a billionth of a trillionth of the greatness that God is. I mean, God is truly the only one. We should worship Him because of who He is. Let's go to the next one. Because of whom Israel chose. And just in case we had an English major here, I made sure I made that word whom instead of who. Yes, I'm still being reminded of my 8th grade English teacher correcting me on the football field for saying who instead of whom. Anyway, who did Israel choose? They chose God. When is this taking place? Leviticus on Mount Sinai. What happened just 2 years prior? They were delivered out of Egypt. They were brought to the edge of Mount Sinai, and God said, I'm the God of the universe. He's speaking to Moses on the top of the mountain. He said, would you go down there and ask the people if they want to follow me and let me be their God? Moses went down to the mountain. Do you want this to happen? They said, sure. So Moses had to go all the way back up to the top. They said, yes. He says, okay, then tell them they need to do these things. And so he goes back down and up. And in that process, they said, we commit ourselves, we want God Almighty to be our God. They chose. And that's when God said, okay, now Moses, you come up here and get these commandments on 2 tablets, and that will be our commitment forever. This is our, and we're going to put it in this very special place called the Ark of the Covenant. This is going to start our relationship. Why should Israel worship God? Among other things, they chose Him. Look at verse 1. He says, I am the Lord your God. Verse 13, I am the Lord your God. They chose. But let's look at one other. Because of what God did for the Israelites. Notice when God completes this first section of chapter 26, He says in verse 13, "I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, so that you would not be their slaves. I broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect." Do you know parents regularly use this line of logic? You do what I say because I changed your diapers. I bought your clothes. I made your meals. But when God says it is, look, I delivered you from bondage. I gave you peace. I gave you life. I deserve to be the one you worship. When people ask the question, why should I have to obey God? What they're really saying is, I don't want to. My fun is more productive than obeying the God of the universe. And all of us have a tug-of-war with that because all of us fail every day. We have our moments when, oh, look at this Jeep. It can bring happiness. And we give in and we go, why did I do that? We've all fallen to Satan's temptations. The only way to be happy is to trust and obey God completely. Would you bow your heads for prayer?